The next two things we're going to learn about are the elasticity of supply and the law of diminishing marginal returns. Let's take a look at two different supply curves. We can see that the one on the left goes from a price range of 0 to $1, just as the one does on the right. And we're looking at supply quantity that goes from 0 to 100. Since you've already learned about the elasticity of demand, I imagine you have an inkling about what could be different about these two supply curves. We see that the one on the left is much more stretched out, and we see that as price changes, there's a difference in the change in quantity than there is with this graph on the right. This is the elasticity of supply. Let's go ahead and grab your notebook and write down that the elasticity of supply is the degree to which a change in price causes a change in quantity supplied. The law of supply tells us that as price increases, the quantity supplied increases. Elasticity tells us how much it increases. We know that supply for goods can be either elastic or inelastic. When we look here at this graph, we're seeing elastic supply. We're seeing that when we make small changes in price, from 25 cents to 50 cents to 75 cents, there's a significant change in the quantity supplied. With this visual demonstration, we're seeing inelastic supply because we're seeing that a small change in price does not result in a significant change in quantity. The price changed, but the quantity only changed a little bit in here. I want you to think about what would make the difference on the supply side. What would make it so that a company could respond to a price change, or maybe couldn't? When we started supply, we were talking about chocolate chip cookies, and we were talking about our motivation and willingness to supply more chocolate chip cookies if the price increased. Well, chocolate chip cookies have elastic supply. When the price increases, we can significantly increase the supply. And that's because production does not require a lot of time or money, and resources are readily available. I think under normal circumstances, it would be pretty reasonable to think in our homes we could have sugar and flour and chocolate chips and the ingredients for chocolate chip cookies, and we could make a batch pretty easily, especially if the price kept going up and we could make more money. Some other examples of things with elastic supply would be sports t-shirts. Think about all the semifinal and final games that we've been to over the years and how in the hallway they're out there silk screening the t-shirts. Can easily make more shirts. Okay? So making those t-shirts doesn't require a lot of time, a lot of money, and the resources are readily available with gray t-shirts and a silk screen. You could say the same about smoothies. They have relatively elastic supply. On this other side, we could consider oranges. Oranges grow on trees and need hot weather, and it takes an amount of time for oranges to grow. So even if the price people were willing to pay for oranges increased, the production of oranges requires time, it's the biggest factor, and requires money and resources not readily available. We can't increase the intensity of the sun, we can't predict the rain, we can't make the growing go any faster. Some other examples of things where the supply can't really respond quickly to the price would be fine art, making a space shuttle, antiques, a rookie baseball card. Just because price increases, none of these things can be made more in a rapid fashion to be able to respond to that price increase. So when we look at our curves, this on the left would be the elastic supply, our chocolate chip cookies, and here on the right would be our oranges, inelastic supply. Now think about your own business and work on page 43 in your Minding My Own Business book and look at and consider the things that you supply. What are the goods or services that you're going to produce with your business? And try to decide if they would have elastic supply or inelastic supply. And you also want to consider why that's important to know. There's a little typo here on page 43 where this should say supply. You want to consider why it is important to know whether supply for your goods or services is elastic or inelastic. The second concept that we're going to consider today is the law of diminishing marginal returns. This is a concept I think you already understand. I'd ask you to just think about a family holiday and people preparing a meal in the kitchen. And I want you to think about what happens when you have one or two people in there doing the cooking, and then maybe a third and a fourth and a fifth and a sixth, and think about how well that works out. I imagine you can predict there's a point at which it's no longer helpful for more people to be going in the kitchen. That's the idea of the law of diminishing marginal returns. Keep taking those notes in your notebook, and let's write down that the law of diminishing marginal returns says that as units of input are added to a fixed supply of other resources, the marginal product increases, then decreases, and eventually becomes negative. So I want you to think about that example in the kitchen, or think about a class car wash. In the class car wash example, as units of input are added, let's stop right there and we'll establish the units of input would be students working at the car wash. So they're going to be your labor input. They've come, they're ready to work at the car wash. When they are added to a fixed supply of other resources, let's pause right there. There'd be a fixed supply of other resources, things like the hoses, sponges, and soap. So you may at first have 7 or 8 students who come to do the car wash, and you have 2 hoses, 2 sponges, and a bottle of soap. But if then there were 10 people and 15 people and 20 people, and you still have just those 2 hoses, 2 sponges, and 1 bottle of soap, it's not going to be as productive or as effective as it could have been. In that definition, we talked about marginal product. So let's look at this graph for a minute and talk about what marginal product is. This comes from your textbook, this graph right here, and we're going to look at this with your assignment for today. But in this particular instance, here is our number of workers. And these workers produce bean bags. And this is their total output of bean bags per hour. Marginal product is calculated by looking at the difference when we add 1 unit of input. So when we went from no workers to 1 worker, and we made 4 bean bags, our marginal product was 4. We produced 4 more bean bags by having that person there. We added another worker, so now we have 2 workers. We were able to make 10 bean bags in an hour. 4 up to 10, so it's a positive 6 for our marginal product. What happens as we continue to add units of input to a fixed supply of other resources is we can see that we continue to make more and we have increasing marginal returns. But at a certain point, when we add more workers, even though we're making more product, our output is more. Our marginal product begins to decrease. We're making more bean bags, but we're not making them at an increasing rate like we were before. Eventually, we're going to reach a point where by adding more workers, we are actually making less bean bags than we were. I want you to think about why that would happen. Why, if there's that fixed supply of other resources, would this be a problem? I'm pretty sure you can figure that out. I imagine you can recognize that eventually, if there's not enough machines or enough equipment for people to be using, that there's going to be inefficiency. There's going to be people standing around. There's going to be people distracting other people from what they're supposed to be doing. There's going to be people running into each other, and they're not going to produce as much as they would if they had fewer people. When we talk about marginal returns, we talk about 3 stages of returns. We talk about this beginning stage when things are going great. This is your increasing marginal returns. We're adding units of input, our output is increasing, and so is our marginal product. So not only are we producing more, but the increments in which we're producing more keep increasing. So we added a worker, we made 6 more. We added another worker, we made 7 more. This stage of returns we call decreasing, because here as we add workers, we're still making more, but not as many more. We're only making 6 more, and then 5 more, and then 3 more, and then 1 more. Eventually, we reach this point, negative marginal returns, where we added a worker, and now we're actually producing fewer units of output than we were before we hired them. Keep in mind, as an employee, you do not want to be the person that is putting us into an area of negative marginal returns. So let's look at this definition one more time. It says, as units of input are added to a fixed supply of other resources, the marginal product increases, then decreases, and eventually becomes negative.